Hey guys, Kevin here. I wanted to share with you a new development with the podcast. It is coming to you from a new podcast hosting service, anchor.fm. So far, I'm really impressed. I really like it. Number one, it's free, which is always great. It's also integrated with Spotify and offers some great analytics on who's listening. Helps me gain some insight into what content would be good for the audience. And you can also record from your phone, which is a nice new feature that I'm using right now. So if you have a podcast or you're interested in starting one, download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started.
The You Can't Make This Up History Podcast, bringing you strange but true things from the past. It's not the average history that you learned in school. We're bringing you the heroes and bringing you the fools, and stories that are just too crazy to believe. The stranger than fiction and super unique.
Hey gang, how are you all doing on this toasty week? This is your host Kevin. I'm coming at you today with kind of a impromptu, somewhat unplanned episode, but sometimes things work out just right and you get a little bit of bonus content. So that's what we have today. I'm very excited to bring a conversation I recently had with an author named Michael Fabey, who wrote a book about how the U.S. Navy builds some of the world's largest aircraft carriers in Virginia. Very interesting topic, and if you've seen Top Gun this summer, you'll notice in this episode we dropped Top Gun a couple times. If you haven't seen it, it's amazing. Definitely go do it. But if you've seen it, you've seen aircraft carriers and kind of the Navy and jets are kind of at the forefront of people's imagination. So it's a timely topic to take a look at. What Michael Fabey does is he looked into, who builds these things and what's involved in it. And it's kind of an interesting thing that I didn't think a whole lot of beforehand. So very interesting conversation for you today. Of course, as usual, if you want to pick up a copy of the book, I've got a link for you down in the description of this episode in your podcast app. So you can just link to that if you want to pick up a copy. And then if you would be so kind, if you enjoy Can't Make This Up, I would love for you to give us a review on whatever you listen to this on, subscribe on your podcast app or YouTube. And then if you want to join me on social media, I'm at CMTU History on pretty much all the social media apps. So without further ado, hope you guys have a good rest of the week. Normally I would tell you to go out for a walk or go for a jog and listen to this podcast. Today I'm going to tell you stay inside where it's nice and cold and just sit and listen to it. All right, here's my conversation with Michael Fabey. Mike Fabey, welcome to the podcast.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, very glad to have you. So we're going to talk a little bit about some very large military equipment today. But before we get started, tell us a little bit about yourself. I understand that you have a long history of reporting military-related issues.
Yeah, I've been doing this kind of reporter thing as a reporter, editor, photographer, that kind of thing for more than 3 decades now. And more than half that time has been spent covering the military, and the last decade or so specifically covering Navy issues.
All right. And so the book that you have that we're going to talk about today is called Heavy Metal, with cool name for a book. Heavy Metal, The Hard Days and Nights of the Shipyard Workers Who Build America's Supercarriers. What made you decide to tackle this topic of how our aircraft carriers get made?
It goes back a long time to the essentially in the very beginning of when I was a reporter. One of the first job interviews I had was for the local paper down in Newport News, Virginia, called the Daily Press. And I went down for a job interview, and I went down the day before and kind of get lay of the land. I start driving around and passed the shipyard and just saw the cityscape, if you will, of this huge, the iconic carrier silhouette, and just kind of stopped me in my tracks. I mean, I'd grown up in Philly, so I was used to seeing a large cityscape, but nothing like this. And I was just mesmerized by it. It just really got my fascination going. Who does that? How do they do that? And so I always want to find out. And then eventually, years later, about covering a yard for the Daily Press. And once I covered a yard and really found out how they did it, I just felt like it was a story that had to be told, what they do in there every day.
So, to give listeners a little bit of perspective, who may not live on the seaboard and may not have had the opportunity to see these things, I know, living in Ohio, we don't have stuff like this. Exactly what is a supercarrier? How big of a vessel are we talking about?
So, I mean, the carrier itself is just enormous. I mean, city blocks long. You know what I mean? I mean, seriously, it's if you were to take the Empire State Building,
yep,
sit down on the side, about the size of a carrier.
That's crazy.
So and on this ship, on top they launch and recover aircraft. So it's an airport, including like an aircraft tower, if you will, that's directing an aircraft. And then on it are living 5,000 or so sailors, pilots, maintainers, and all that kind of thing. It's run by a couple of nuclear power plants. It's got hospital facilities. It's basically it's a floating Navy base too. I mean, it's just this massive, as they call it, at one point, almost 100,000 tons of diplomacy that's roams around the sea.
What you're describing, this is more people than the town I grew up in.
It's an incredible thing to watch as it come together and to go out as they test it and operate and everything like that, that they can get something like this out and see and operate the way it does.
Okay, and specifically the place where these are produced is Newport News.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, can you tell us a little bit about how this particular site came to be the shipyard to build such large craft?
You go back to the kind of quote unquote very, very beginning, way back a little bit after the Civil War. A guy named Huntington, Carl Huntington, was traveling around. He was one of the rail magnates that one of the top 4 or 5 had put together the rail system across the U.S. And he was looking for a kind of a rail terminus, if you will, for some coal exporting he wanted to do. And while traveling along the seaboard there, he came across a site that he just thought was a fantastic place to put up a yard and a terminus for this coal terminal so he could do coal exports. And then from there, they basically start to build ships commercially, and then also for the U.S. government, for the Navy. And that's, it's a perfect place for it. The weather there, as he wrote about way back when, was kind of perfect. I mean, you had cold winters, but they weren't like cold all the time. The summers can be unbearable sometimes, but it was something you still work in. It was just a place to have, open to the sea, easy access to the sea, easy access to raw materials, lots of labor around, that kind of thing.
And so I'm assuming they've had to do some things infrastructure wise to the city and to the harbor area to make it capable of this type of industry.
Well, it's sort of almost a backwards kind of thing. So they built the city to basically serve the yard. There was a yard, the terminus first, and then a yard, and then basically the company, which became Newport News Shipbuilding, needed a city to support that. Needed, people living in there to come and work in the yard. So they actually, planners come down from the north, actually some from Philadelphia area, where I grew up, and they came down and planned the yard and the city in such a way they kind of grew up together, and the city itself grew up around the yard. But through the years, they've expanded on that. They put in the wharves first and the piers, and then the construction facilities around there, the cranes, to a point where they have, as they call Big Blue, the gantry crane, which is biggest in the hemisphere. But it has grown up. The whole region essentially has grown up around that yard.
So this is one of those towns where everybody they work at the shipyard.
Everyone either works at the shipyard, has someone in the family works at the shipyard, or knows someone works at the shipyard. The joke down there is you got three jobs you can go to now. That's the shipyard, the military, Walmart. But yeah, I mean, it is something that it's something like, well, if I can't find a job somewhere else, there's always a yard. There is that kind of thing. There's also generations of folks who work there, whose grandfathers worked there or fathers, now they work there. There's an awful lot of that at the yard as well. So yeah, it's just, it's something that's sort of always there, omnipresent. I mean, in at its biggest times, most prolific times, you got 30,000 people working there. So it's a city within a city.
What kind of jobs do people do to build these? What types of trades and skills and know-how are needed?
Well, picture almost any kind of even general construction site. In many ways, a carrier it's made up of like these compartments are like what you would see in a skyscraper in some ways. I mean, a different sort because they're meant for the military. But so you've got welders, you've got electricians, you're going to have ship fitters, the ones who move the big heavy pieces together. So you're going to have someone who operates, for example, Big Blue. So they operate gantry trains. Any kind of construction site, any kind of regular manufacturing plant, you're going to have the yard because they make so much of, if you have that city within a city, well, it's building a floating city. So imagine what you have every day in and out of a regular city, the kind of workers you were having there, making that go every day. That's exactly what you have putting together the ship.
Now, the super carrier you look at in the book is the USS John F. Kennedy, correct?
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that. Now, that's described as a next generation carrier.
Right. So this is for going back to Vietnam, they have what they call the Nimitz class ships, named after the first ship. They're all named the first ship of their class, and it's the USS Nimitz. And that's been the carrier that anyone who sees a carrier now on TV at some hot spot around the world, that's what's going there. So for this next,
so when I watch Top Gun this summer, that's what we're launching off.
That's what you're going to watch on that one, right? Yes. Okay. The original Top Gun, you had some carriers before Nimitz class, but now for this Top Gun, that's what you're going to see is Nimitz class carriers. Right. So for this one, they wanted a whole new launch recovery system, which uses electromagnetic parts instead of hydraulics. So it's a lot more maintainable, a lot more operational controllable, a lot more efficient. You're going to have some different ways the ship is designed and constructed to take advantage of the digital way of doing things nowadays, all that kind of thing. The first ship of that class was the Ford, which is now supposed to go on its first operational deployment at the end of this year. The Kennedy is the second of the first class. So Ford was, as they call it, CVN, or carrier vessel nuclear, 78, and the Kennedy is 79. And for this one, they wanted to basically iron out a lot of, shall we say, the wrinkles that they had on the Ford. There were they had 23 new technologies on the Ford. Right now, the Navy will no longer do more than 2 or 3 new technologies because of how much challenging times they had putting the Ford together with all that new technology. But as a result, with the Kennedy, you have a chance to kind of, as I said, iron out those wrinkles. So you have the second class ship following these brand new technologies that they think will be down, not perfect, certainly better than what they did on the Ford. Go out there, for example, they expect to be able to launch recover aircraft at almost like a third greater the rate than what they do now. So that means more aircraft in the air going back and forth. That means you can do more combat system, work, or if you have to do, more humanitarian aid, same kind of thing. I mean, this will be a much more efficient ship, fewer sailors, it'll be less expensive to operate, that kind of thing. And also the air wing, as they call it, that's the aircraft they put on there, all belong to this air wing. The one of the future is going to include things like more unmanned aircraft. And right now on the Nimitz class, the way the launch systems especially are made, they're not made to handle the unmanned aircraft. They can almost destroy the aircraft, even trying to launch them. Whereas with this Ford class and now the Kennedy being second ship of that, to be able to launch this aircraft and control those launching mechanisms in such a way you'd be able to do that. But the John Kennedy will not be USS until it's commissioned. Only sailors and shipbuilders would know that.
Okay. So it's not till it's completed.
Yeah. When it's actually the Navy, they actually put it into the fleet, then it becomes a USS, as they call it, ship. Until then, it's just the John F. Kennedy, the carrier John F. Kennedy. Okay. But I mean, like I said, Navy folks will know that, shipbuilder folks will know that, and no one else will. It won't even register.
So how long of a time frame are we talking about building one of these things?
They cut steel, as they call it, on the Kennedy back in 2011, and they right now they're looking at maybe another year and a half, maybe 2 years before that ship is going to be kind of out and testing and stuff like that.
So this is almost a 15-year project.
So yes, from like when you get that steel in there and start it and everything like that. Right now, they have contracts for 2 at a time, and they expect to cut that enormously. I mean, maybe even by half. I mean, round figures, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So a lot of this had to do with it didn't take that long necessarily build the ship. It took a lot of that time for the Pentagon to buy the ship and resource the ship, and Congress to approve the funds for the ship, if you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. It's not like they were starting and they were going full throttle the whole time and all that kind of stuff. It really was a lot more of what goes on in DC is going to determine sometimes how long it actually takes for these ships getting together.
So kind of with a lot of other, I guess, public works projects, you get these stops and starts, and different administrations have different priorities. And
mm-hmm. Absolutely. In fact, if you go back to, I was talking about all the new technology on the Ford, for example, mm-hmm. The original plan had been to spread out all those different kinds of technologies across like 3 or 4 different ships. A couple in the Nimitz class, it will last one in the Nimitz class, and then for the first 3 of the Ford class. But that was what it was back on, pre-Bush 1. I mean, back 2 days actually Bush 1. But then when Rumsfeld became defense secretary and we won the Cold War, they said, oh, well, there's no great big challenging national power out there, so we can just go ahead and do a revolutionary change. So they decided to put all the technologies on one ship. And quite honestly, that's what created an awful lot of problems in getting the Ford together. So yeah, you have all kinds of things that happen in DC or at the Pentagon that really do affect the program.
So, that's stuff where you have the politicians are making these decisions, they're working with the Pentagon. How does that affect just, the men and women on the ground building this thing, the steel workers and the electricians and people like that? How do those battles affect them?
So the day-to-day job of what they do, it really doesn't have that grave an impact. It's not as if they're going in there and saying, oh, I'm worried about what's going on in DC and everything like that. They go in there, I mean, they have just basically a handful of things on their mind, the most important of which, quite honestly, is doing the best job they can at every day. I mean, there's so much riding on what they do, I mean, sure, it's their shipyard pride, their own pride in their work, but these are ships that are going out to war. If they don't do something right, I mean, a valve goes on it, somewhere, that ship goes down, there's 5,000 sailors' lives that are dependent on those kind of things. So they have to do that right. The second thing they want to make sure they do is they want to make sure they end their shift alive in one piece. And then they also want to make sure that their workmates end their shifts alive in one piece. So day to day, that's what they worry about. Where it does have an impact, though, is in the size of the workforce. So if it's taken longer for Washington to decide when they want to really start building the carrier, I said they cut steel on the Kennedy back in 2011, but they got the actual contract to build a ship in 2015. And that's when they could really put the pedal to the metal and start doing the work. Mm-hmm. Well, in between, you know, you have enough workers just to keep the job going, so to speak. So now you got to ramp up, you know. So right now, for example, a yard is looking to hire 5,000 workers because it has 2 new carriers that it went under contract. They're finishing up the Kennedy, so it's another carrier there, and they have all these subs they're also building. So all this work is coming at one time, and they have to ramp up work. You know, if another administration comes in, they decide, oh, we don't want to build all that, then they have to ramp down work, and that's workers who leave. And it's not as if they're sitting around waiting for it to be called again. They now have a marketable skill. They're going someplace else in the country that needs them. So that's where you have the problems is that kind of wave, that crest and trough of workers they need for these projects as Washington takes its time deciding when it's going to build things and when it isn't.
And I imagine this really puts some strain on the town itself.
I don't know if strain is the right word, partly because this is exactly sort of how, as I said, Newport News developed. And they're used to this in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. And the other thing, quite honestly, is that the shipyard pulls from awful large area. So you've got a lot of folks driving up from the Carolinas, for example. A lot of folks drive, and beginning the book, I talk about people who are driving down what they call the Middle Peninsula, which is, you know, some of them, you know, that's going to be like a 45-minute drive, you know, and not 45 minutes waiting in traffic either. I mean, that's, you know, it's a fair distance, shall we say. So it's kind of dispersed throughout. The city itself, Newport News, is developed in a kind of an odd way lately. Before, everything was downtown, it was all around the yard. But now the yard itself has grown, has taken off a lot of the buildings just outside the gates even. And the city has developed, they call it city center, if you will. It's actually a little bit farther north up the road from the yard now. And it's got all the kind of things we normally have in that kind of modern city of shopping centers, eating places, you know, the Lowe's, the Home Depots, all that stuff is sort of like a little bit north now or other parts of the city. So it's kind of developed more, I guess, along modern city. It's diversified a little bit, much more than it was way back when. So I'm not sure there's as much of a strain as maybe it used to be. You know, having said that, I mean, if you're down there when that 3:30 whistle goes off, you're not going to move anywhere fast, almost anywhere around the area.
And then, you know, do you want to share a little bit about some of the people that you met in researching this and getting their stories?
So that's what I think is the kind of the one thing that really will gravitate folks to reading this, at least I hope it will, is the stories of the people who work there. Because as I said, they go in there and it's not a 9-to-5 job for most of them. I mean, of course, when you have 30,000 people together at one time, sometimes you're just going to have that 9-to-5 mentality. But for most of them, it's not the case at all. They take a lot of pride in their work. They take a lot of pride in the fact that, you know, their daddies work there, their granddaddies work there, and especially, let me tell you, a lot of their grandmoms work there, you know, and their moms work there, kind of thing. You know, so when they look up on the TV screen and they see a picture of a carrier in the news story saying they're going out to a new hotspot, believe me, their chest swelled a lot of pride for that. But, you know, it's the way that the workers down there have actually kind of taken control of what they do. I mean, they're very, you know, very proactive in the yard of making sure they're learning all the new ways of shipbuilding or just manufacturing, a lot of digital stuff going on, but also just in the way that they're treated. The yard going back to when it was first started up until the middle half of the last century or so, could be best described almost as a plantation system. At least that's the way workers who had worked there eons ago had told me about it. And it took a lot to get the union there. And one of the people who I highlight in the book is a guy named Bill Bowser. Bill, like many, his father worked in the yard. And he went in there, quite honestly, as a disciple of Malcolm X. He was a young black man who was bound and determined. And then we went to the yard in the 60s, sort of bring that whole, as he even said, the black power to the white people in the yard. And that's what he had planned to do. But once he got in the yard and started working around with everybody, there is a sense of family there. I mean, people meet their fall, love, get married, that kind of thing. There's this amazing sense of overarching family, even with the different kinds of partisanship views you see, or religious views that you'll find in any large area like that. Still, there's a sense of family. As a sense of family, he told me he realized that, it's not that divisive element I thought it was. The real fight here is us as a working class against folks who he has seen in his mind taken advantage of that working class. And so they worked really hard to bring the union. And he worked with other workers, especially a guy named Russ Axum, and went around the whole area to places, quite honestly, that no one was welcome. I mean, that was back in the day, back in the 60s and 70s and everything, where, if you talk about unionism, you might as well talk about communism. And they just worked at it, and they had to fight not only locally. I mean, this was a fight that was carried out in churches, even from the pulpit. This was a fight that was carried out in barbershops, and then it was a fight that was carried out in the streets. I mean, Bill one time had to be taken in an ambulance because his head got cracked open as you had police coming in and fights going on both sides. And then it even went to the courts and up to the highest courts, and they still fought and got that union in there. And that to me was just something that showed that what could happen when everyone put their kind of, with more physical separating instincts aside and came together. So that was one of the things. But also, I mean, just the way that the folks would go in there and learn their trades. And when he described the way, for example, they had to, one guy, Jordan Patterson, had to hang up upside down, almost like Batman, he said, in order to paint a tight spot. He had to crawl in backwards to a place that, was almost like a metal coffin. He was encased so close just to get and paint a tight spot. You have these workers up there who have to basically, climb up, several like stories high, like skyscraper level, and they'd be up there hanging off, to try to weld or try to get a part in just right, and then on top of that, the way they'd have to go in and just make sure that everything lined up just right. I mean, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of studs, for example, have to be lined up just right. And just to make sure that they do that painstaking day after day after day. And you can see how someone would get bored by doing that. And to know that, if they get bored, if they just for a second don't focus on what they're doing, a spark could go out, catch fire, and then, a fire on any ship, especially one that's under construction, could just be the end of it. I mean, people's lives, and at several courses in the ship, well, not on this ship, but in the shipyard during the course I was writing, so people did lose their lives because of accidents and things like that. I mean, it's just that kind of thing, like I have a job to do. I'm going down, someone's going out into a combat zone, really on the front lines. And it's just almost the way they just do it, So that was one of the things that really got me. And then the guy who was in charge and responsible for all this going on was a guy named Mike Butler. And the most selfless guy I'd ever seen in there. He in going through the manuscript of the book, he demanded some parts be changed because he thought too much focus was on him. And yet he was responsible for bringing all of this together, creating, something to have all this seemingly chaotic stuff that was going on. And the way he ran Herta was just amazing.
As you spoke with these people, did you get a sense that they kind of feel that they're contributing to the nation?
I mean, they really have a patriotic sense of what they're doing that I have not seen in other, waterfronts that I've covered for other type of businesses or in other plants that I've covered. I mean, there's just this real sense of what they do makes a difference, you know, to not only to the nation, but also, you know, for the sailors. And it's very interesting that, you know, a carrier, as it comes together, parts of the ship get done before the parts do. And actually, a lot of those parts will be, as they say, turned over to the Navy. And so you have actually the Navy plank owners, sailors. Plank owners are the first sailors assigned to the ship. And they're coming on and actually working on the ship as our parts of the ship are being built. So the sailors and the steelworkers actually kind of get to know each other. And there's a sense of brotherhood and sisterhood of what they're doing together. You know, the steelworkers are bringing the spine of the ship, and the sailors are bringing the spirit of the ship, and they're bringing it all together. And so you have this sense of really, like, you know, they're wearing a different kind of uniform, but it's almost like a national uniform that most of them feel that they are wearing themselves. As I said, they know that, you know, this ship is meant to go into combat. And even if it's not in combat, it's daily operations where you have nuclear power plants on board, aircraft taken on and off, jet fuel all over the place. Even in that environment, anything that is substandard, that isn't quite right, could put thousands of American sailors' lives in jeopardy. And they honestly don't want to do that. They really don't. I've had, when I was at Daily Press, I had shipyard workers who would come to me about things they thought that weren't being done quite right and putting their jobs at risk and tell me this, but they would come and say, because we're scared for the sailors, you know? So it's a real deep down, baked in kind of feeling that they have about this, you know? And I'll tell you, it really kind of took greater hold during COVID. When COVID hit, and the rest of the nation almost, or as far as parts of the rest of the nation, had to shut down, Newport News Shipbuilding did not. They couldn't shut down. They had a schedule to keep because they had carriers to get out, they had submarines to get out. So they can't just shut down. So the work on Kennedy kept on. And they were deemed with, as they said, essential workers. That's what the government said they were, essential workers. And you could see the pride that they had when they were told that. The union put it out in the newsletter and everything else. They were essential workers. And I'll tell you, when they came back to do contract negotiations at the end last year, don't think for a second they let the company forget that they were deemed essential workers. And the big call sign was essential pay for essential work, or essential workers demand essential pay. So there is that very, very strong sense of that. I mean, you know, hey, you know, there's an awful lot more Fords on the road than there are carriers in the ocean, you know, but that Ford isn't something you're going to see on a TV screen going out to, you know, go out to somewhere in the Arabian Gulf or someplace like that, or going to South China Sea, you know, and someplace like that, carrying the American flag and American sailors to, you know, to basically show the American presence.
Well, no, these are the key instrument of the American military.
It's as I said earlier, it's the 100,000 tons of diplomacy.
Yeah,
you know, nothing says we're here like that silhouette of a carrier.
All right. Well, Mike, this is such a cool idea. You know, it's something that I think a lot of people, if they you know, if they went and saw Top Gun and they see it, or if they see an aircraft carrier on the news, you know, they kind of take it for granted. And I really like that you didn't take it for granted, and you got curious about, how do you make one of those? Who makes one of those? So I think this is a really cool idea for a deep dive into this industry. So if someone is interested in this topic and wants to learn a little bit more, where can they go to learn more about your book or learn more about your work?
Well, so I mean, the easiest one to remember is my name is Michael Fabey, Michael Fabey, Fabey.com, and the carrier stuff is listed there. The book's put out by HarperCollins. It's on your usual, you know, online shopping places like Amazon and everything like that. It's in all the bookstores. I think that's the easiest thing to do. And your note of Top Gun, I'll say this, that in this book, you'll find the real Top Guns. I mean, the actual folks who used to take off of carriers who were involved in designing and building of these aircraft and then testing and operating them. But then you also learn a lot about the top guns on the waterfront, and that's the guys who make all that possible, the guys and the women who do. And their stories are absolutely amazing. Anyone who's ever punched a clock or anything will relate to, what it's like to only have a half hour for lunch, but imagine having only a half hour for lunch when you're 6 stories down in a carrier welding some steel together.
All right. Well, Mike, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today.
Thank you. Very much appreciate it.